was 1941, and the smell of salt and oil hung over the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California. The clang of steel echoed across the docks as sparks flew from the torches of thousands of welders racing to prepare America's naval fleet. Most of them were ordinary men, laborers, mechanics, welders earning just enough to feed their families during the tense months before America entered the war. But among them was one man whose hands, blackened by smoke and calloused by heat, were about to change the course of industrial warfare forever. His name was Ted Nelson, a quiet, wiry man in his 30s who worked for just $11 a day. To most of his fellow workers, Nelson was just another face behind the mask, steady, dependable, and a little obsessive. But those who worked beside him noticed something different. When others took smoke breaks, Ted stayed behind, scribbling on scraps of paper or bending over a small metal jig, lost in thought. He wasn't satisfied with how things were done. Welding on the hulls of ships was grueling, dangerous work. Men perched on scaffolding or clung to rope harnesses as they fused steel plates together in awkward positions. It took time, too much time. Every ship required miles of welds, and each weld meant man-hours lost to inefficiency. The process was slow, the scaffolding cumbersome, and production was constantly delayed. Ted saw it every day, the fatigue, the waste, the near accidents, and he believed there had to be a better way. At night, in his small rented room not far from the shipyard, Ted worked by the dim light of a single bulb. He had an idea that seemed so simple it almost felt absurd. What if, instead of attaching brackets, rivets, or fittings by hand, a welder could instantly fuse them to a steel surface with a single pull of a trigger, a handheld gun, spring-loaded, with a small ceramic cap that shielded the arc, allowing perfect welds even in hard-to-reach spots. It was quick, clean, and precise. No scaffolding, no wasted hours. He called it stud welding. For months, Ted experimented with scrap metal and improvised parts. He melted, burned, and broke countless prototypes. His hands bore the marks of his failures, cuts, burns, scars, but each mistake brought him closer to something that worked. Eventually, after endless nights of tinkering, he held in his hand a crude, bulky device that could do what no welder's tool had ever done before. The next morning, he walked into the office of his supervisor at the Mare Island Shipyard. He was nervous but excited, holding the odd-looking gun wrapped in a piece of cloth. His supervisor, a broad man with a cigar in his mouth, barely looked up from his desk. Ted spoke quickly, passionately, explaining how this gun could revolutionize welding, save time, and improve safety. He even demonstrated it on a small steel plate he'd brought along. The results were immediate. In a single burst, the stud was fused perfectly to the surface, stronger and faster than any traditional weld. Ted smiled, waiting for a reaction, but his supervisor frowned. "What is this, some kind of toy?" He grumbled. "We don't have time for experiments, Nelson. We've got ships to finish. Go back to work," Ted insisted, showing calculations, diagrams, and results. But the man's patience thinned. "We're the Navy, son. We don't change what works. Take that contraption and forget about it." It was rejection, flat, final, and humiliating. The other men in the room chuckled under their breath as Ted packed up his invention and walked out. But beneath the sting of embarrassment, a spark of resolve burned inside him. If they wouldn't believe him, he'd prove them wrong himself. A few weeks later, Ted Nelson quit his job. It was a bold move, especially with the world inching toward war and jobs scarce. He borrowed every dollar he could, scraping together $95,000 from local businessmen, friends, and small investors. With the money, he rented a small workshop and set up what would become the first prototype lab for stud welding equipment. The workshop was little more than a garage filled with metal scraps, cables, and the smell of ozone. But there, surrounded by the hum of machinery, Ted's vision began to take shape. He refined the design of his gun, using spring tension and ceramic flux to shield the molten metal from oxidation. The result was a clean, precise weld that could be performed in seconds. No scaffolds, no grinding, no extra tools. It was quite literally a spark of genius. Still, no one seemed to care. The Navy had dismissed him, shipyard managers ignored him, and industrial firms refused to invest. "It's too radical," they said. "It'll never hold up on real ships." Ted's wife worried constantly about the debts, the long nights, and the possibility that all his efforts would end in failure. But Ted didn't stop. Each rejection only hardened his resolve. December 7, 1941. The radio crackled with panic that Sunday morning as news of Pearl Harbor spread across the nation. The Pacific Fleet had been decimated. Battleships burned in the harbor, and America was thrust into war. Overnight, the country that had once been divided by uncertainty became united by purpose. Factories lit up across the nation, and shipyards that had once worked at a steady pace were now running 24 hours a day. The Navy needed ships, and fast. Suddenly, every man-hour mattered. Every delay was a potential disaster. The old ways of building ships weren't fast enough to meet wartime demand. Liberty ships, destroyers, submarines all had to be built in record time. And that's when Ted Nelson's invention, the same one that had been laughed out of the shipyard, became the one thing the Navy desperately needed. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, word spread through the industrial network about a strange welding gun that could save time and labor. Representatives from several shipyards came knocking on Ted's workshop door. They watched as he demonstrated the stud welding gun, each metal stud attaching perfectly in less than a second. They did the math, realizing what it could mean. If every bracket, beam, and deck plate could be welded this fast, shipbuilding time could be slashed by months. Contracts followed almost overnight. The same Navy officials who had dismissed him now returned with open checkbooks, eager to purchase his guns by the hundreds. Ted could barely keep up with demand. His small garage became a factory, then a company, Nelson Stud Welding, and by early 1942, his technology was being installed in every major U.S. shipyard. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, production skyrocketed. Where once it took weeks to mount fittings and fixtures, workers armed with Ted Nelson's guns completed them in days. The Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that would become the lifeline of the Allied war effort, rolled off the docks faster than anyone thought possible. Some were built in less than 2 weeks, a feat that stunned even the most optimistic planners. Nelson's invention didn't just save time, it saved lives. By eliminating the need for men to climb dangerous scaffolds and hang from ship hulls, accidents dropped dramatically. Welders could now work safely from solid ground, attaching fittings, ladders, and brackets with pinpoint precision. By mid-1943, the numbers were staggering. The Navy calculated that stud welding had saved over 50 million man-hours. 50 million hours, time that could be spent on new ships, planes, and weapons. It wasn't just a technological innovation. It was a weapon of efficiency. The Liberty ships kept coming, 2,710 in total, each one a steel symbol of America's industrial might. Submarines, destroyers, aircraft carriers, all benefited from Nelson's gun. Engineers began adapting the technology for tanks, bridges, and even aircraft parts. The humble welder who had once been dismissed as a mad inventor was now hailed as a genius of wartime production. Yet Ted Nelson himself remained modest. He refused lavish praise, saying only that he'd done what anyone with a bit of imagination and persistence could do. "You don't win wars with weapons alone," he once told a journalist. "You win them with ideas, and the courage to make those ideas real." As the war raged on, Ted continued improving his equipment, ensuring his guns could withstand field conditions and constant use. Each design became lighter, faster, more reliable. Workers across the country came to know the Nelson gun as a symbol of modern ingenuity. It became so integral to production that some shipyards refused to operate without it. When the war finally began to turn in favor of the Allies, thanks to the vast industrial output of the United States, few outside the factories and shipyards knew the name Ted Nelson, yet his work had quietly made possible one of the greatest logistical achievements in human history: the mass construction of a naval fleet capable of defeating tyranny across 2 oceans. By 1945, when victory was finally declared, Ted Nelson received 2 Navy E citations for excellence in production, a rare honor for a civilian inventor. He had gone from being an ignored welder to one of the unsung heroes of the American war machine. But even then, he rarely spoke of himself. He preferred the workshop to the spotlight, the sound of metal and electricity to applause. What mattered most to him wasn't fame or fortune. It was the satisfaction of seeing his idea make a difference. And as the fires of war dimmed and peace returned, the technology he created didn't fade into history. Stud welding became standard in shipyards, construction sites, and manufacturing plants around the world. Bridges, skyscrapers, pipelines, all would one day bear the silent imprint of his invention. For Ted Nelson, the legacy was never about glory. It was about proving that innovation can come from anywhere, even from an $11 a day welder with a dream. The Navy had once called his idea foolish, but his mad gun ended up saving more than time. It saved lives, and perhaps it helped save the war. The war had changed everything. What began as chaos and desperation had turned into a rhythm of precision and purpose. Across America's shipyards, the nights burned brighter than the days. Welders, mechanics, and engineers worked side by side under the floodlights, their faces illuminated by sparks that danced across the steel hulls of ships. The rhythmic hiss of welding torches echoed like a song of determination, and hidden within that symphony of industry was the sound of Ted Nelson's invention, the steady crack and flash of the stud welding gun. Every spark told a story. Each one meant time saved, risk avoided, progress made. The men using his guns often didn't know who had built them. To them, it was simply another tool, efficient, reliable, indispensable. But to those who did know, Ted's name had begun to travel through whispered admiration. Foremen spoke of him as the guy who built the Navy's secret weapon for shipbuilding. Engineers wrote his name on blueprints. Procurement officers signed off requests marked Nelson Stud Welding Urgent. By 1944, Ted Nelson's company was producing thousands of welding guns and power units each month. His once small workshop had grown into a humming factory that supplied nearly every naval and commercial shipyard in the United States. From Mare Island to the Kaiser yards in Oregon, from Bethlehem Steel to the great shipbuilding docks in the East, his design had become standard equipment. Ted had gone from working alone in a dim garage to managing hundreds of employees. The transition wasn't easy. He was still a welder at heart, more comfortable in grease-stained overalls than in an office suit. But he adapted, driven by the belief that his work mattered far beyond profit. He hired other welders, men who had struggled like him, giving them jobs, training, and a chance to build something meaningful. For many of them, this factory wasn't just a workplace. It was a piece of the war effort, a place where they could feel they were helping to end it. As American forces pushed across Europe and the Pacific, the demand for ships only grew. Liberty ships carried food, fuel, and ammunition to Allied troops across the oceans. Destroyers escorted convoys through submarine-infested waters. Submarines prowled the depths, strangling Axis supply lines. Behind every mission, every voyage, there was the silent strength of the vessels themselves, steel welded by the hands of men using Ted Nelson's guns. The numbers became almost unreal. 50 million man-hours saved, hundreds of thousands of fittings attached in seconds rather than minutes. The U.S. Navy could now produce a fleet faster than the enemy could sink it. It was an advantage not measured in firepower but in time, and time in war was everything. By now, reporters had begun to take notice. Industrial journals published pieces on the welding revolution, sweeping through shipyards. Some credited corporate engineers, others the Navy's Bureau of Ships, but a few articles finally mentioned the man behind it all. Ted Nelson, the welder-turned-inventor who had changed modern manufacturing. When asked how he'd done it, Ted simply smiled and said, by refusing to believe the word no. Still, he remained largely unknown outside the industry. There were no parades for welders, no medals for engineers, but among those who built the machinery of victory, his name became synonymous with ingenuity. In 1944, Nelson received a personal letter from the Navy Department commending his contribution to national defense. It wasn't just a formality. It was an acknowledgement that one man's stubborn idea had become a pillar of America's war production. Later that year, he was awarded his first Navy E citation for excellence in production, a prestigious honor typically reserved for entire companies, not individuals. When reporters asked how it felt, he shrugged. "It feels like a good day's work," he said. But beneath his calm demeanor, Ted was exhausted. Years of constant labor, stress, and financial strain had taken a toll. He rarely slept more than a few hours, always returning to the workshop to refine designs, train workers, or oversee production. He often said, "If a tool can save a second, it can save a life." That belief kept him going through the darkest hours of the war. As the tide turned in favor of the Allies, and American bombers filled the skies over Europe, the factories back home kept churning. Even after the Normandy landings in 1944, when the outcome seemed inevitable, there was no slowing down. The Navy continued to demand ships at an unprecedented rate. In one of the Kaiser shipyards, workers broke a record by assembling a Liberty ship in just 4 days and 15 hours. The newspapers called it a miracle of modern engineering. Few mentioned that the miracle depended on tools like Ted Nelson's gun, which allowed welders to mount fittings, brackets, and beams faster than ever before. It was an invisible victory, but a victory nonetheless. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, there was celebration, relief, and quiet reflection. But for Ted, it was also a moment of reckoning. He had spent years consumed by one purpose: helping his country win the war through efficiency and invention. Now, with peace returning, he wondered what would come next. Many wartime industries faced closure as contracts were canceled and factories went silent. Workers who had once labored day and night were suddenly without jobs. But Ted refused to let his creation fade into history. He saw beyond the war, to a world that would soon rebuild itself, a world that would need better, faster, safer ways to construct everything from bridges to skyscrapers. He began adapting his stud welding systems for civilian use. Construction companies saw the potential immediately. His guns could attach steel beams, connect girders, and mount components with unmatched speed. What had once been a military innovation was now a cornerstone of modern infrastructure. In post-war America, as cities grew and highways spread, Ted Nelson's technology became part of the invisible framework of progress. Bridges, power plants, and factories used his methods. Even railroads and oil refineries adopted stud welding as standard practice. Everywhere steel met steel, Ted's idea found a place. But Ted himself never grew complacent. He was still restless, still searching for improvement. He once told a young engineer at his factory, "The world doesn't move forward on inventions, it moves forward on improvements. Anyone can invent something once. The challenge is to keep making it better." In 1947, Ted was invited to Washington, D.C. to receive a second Navy E citation for continued excellence in production and innovation. Standing among military officials and industry leaders, he listened as a Navy representative described how his welding guns had helped build 2,610 Liberty ships and 203 submarines. Ted lowered his head humbly, his rough hands clasped together, as applause filled the room. When he returned home, he hung the citation on the wall of his workshop, not his office, but the same place where he had once burned his fingers testing prototypes. It wasn't just a memento. It was a reminder of every hour, every rejection, every spark that had brought him to that moment. In the years that followed, the Nelson Stud Welding Company expanded internationally. Shipyards in Britain, France, and Japan began licensing his technology. Engineers in Germany studied it as a model for post-war reconstruction. In a world scarred by conflict, Ted's invention became a symbol of rebuilding, of using ingenuity not for destruction, but for creation. Ted never sought fame, but it found him in small ways. Engineering schools invited him to speak. Trade magazines called him the man who welded the world. Yet he always deflected credit to the welders, the men and women who used his tools every day. "They're the ones who make it real," he'd say. "A gun's just a piece of metal until someone pulls the trigger." Even as automation began creeping into factories during the 1950s, stud welding remained essential. No robot or machine could yet match the precision and adaptability of Nelson's design. His technology became a bridge between human skill and mechanical efficiency, proof that progress and craftsmanship could coexist. By the time Ted approached his 60s, his company was thriving, but he remained the same quiet, practical man he had always been. He still spent hours on the factory floor, sleeves rolled up, checking machines, talking with workers, suggesting small adjustments. He never stopped inventing, filing dozens of patents throughout his life for improvements in welding, fastening, and electrical systems. When people asked what motivated him, his answer was always the same: "Because I saw something wrong and wanted to fix it." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of his entire journey, from a rejected idea in a shipyard office to a global technology that shaped modern industry. Ted Nelson passed away quietly, leaving behind a legacy that most people would never see, but almost everyone would feel. His guns had helped build the ships that won the war, the bridges that connected nations, and the skyscrapers that defined modern skylines. Even today, every time a steel stud fuses with a beam in a fraction of a second, the echo of his vision lives on. Engineers still use the term Nelson stud to describe the process he pioneered more than 80 years ago. His name, engraved in the foundations of countless structures, remains a silent tribute to what one man can accomplish when he refuses to give up. History often remembers generals and presidents, the leaders who commanded armies and signed treaties. But the truth is, wars, and the world that follows them, are built by ordinary people who refuse to accept limitations. Ted Nelson was one of them. He didn't carry a rifle or fly a plane. His battlefield was a workshop. His weapon, a welding gun, and his victory, the saving of 50 million man-hours that helped America build a fleet powerful enough to protect freedom across the globe. When we look back at the Second World War, we see maps, battles, and heroes. But behind those victories were thousands of invisible hands, and among them the steady, determined hands of a welder who believed that innovation could change the world. Ted Nelson proved that even in the darkest times, progress doesn't come from authority or wealth. It comes from courage, the courage to think differently, to fail, to try again, and to keep building when no one believes in you. The sparks that flew from his gun during those long nights of war were more than molten steel. They were sparks of imagination, perseverance, and the indomitable spirit of human invention. And somewhere, in the hum of every shipyard and the glow of every welder's torch, that spirit still burns.